In the climate-controlled archives of the Museum of Childhood in Edinburgh, Scotland, housed within a specially designed preservation case that maintains the precise temperature and humidity levels necessary to protect photographic materials from the dawn of the 20th century, sits an image that has fundamentally changed our understanding of Victorian childhood, superstition, and the dark practices that flourished beneath the veneer of proper society. The photograph, taken in the summer of 1900 by itinerant portrait photographer Marcus Whitman during his tour of rural Yorkshire villages, shows 8-year-old Evangeline Blackwood seated in her family's modest parlour, clutching her beloved porcelain doll with an intensity that speaks to the profound bond between child and cherished companion. The image appears, at first examination, to be nothing more than a typical example of late Victorian portrait photography, capturing a moment of domestic tranquility with the formal composition and careful staging that characterized professional photography of the era. Evangeline sits perfectly still in a high-backed wooden chair, her small hands wrapped protectively around the doll's delicate porcelain torso, her expression serious and composed, in the manner expected of children posing for such formal documentation. She wears her finest dress, a white cotton garment with intricate lace trim that speaks to her family's modest prosperity, and her dark hair is arranged in careful ringlets that frame her pale, solemn face. The doll itself is a masterpiece of late 19th century craftsmanship, standing approximately 18 inches tall, with a bisque porcelain head that displays the exquisite attention to detail characteristic of German doll makers of the period. Her painted features are delicate and lifelike, with rosy cheeks, carefully rendered eyelashes, and glass eyes that seem to follow the viewer with an unsettling intensity. She wears a miniature version of fashionable adult clothing, complete with tiny buttons, intricate embroidery, and a silk ribbon that adorns her elaborately styled mohair wig. Dr. Margaret Ashworth, curator of historical photographs at the Museum of Childhood, first encountered this particular image in 2019 when it was donated to the museum's collection by the estate of Mrs. Florence Hartwell, whose great-grandmother had been Evangeline Blackwood's closest childhood friend. The photograph had remained in the Hartwell family for over a century, passed down through generations, along with whispered stories about Evangeline's tragic fate and the strange circumstances that had surrounded her brief life in the small Yorkshire village of Thornfield. According to family legend, Evangeline had died under mysterious circumstances just 3 months after this photograph was taken, succumbing to what the local physician had described as a wasting illness that defied medical explanation. The child had simply begun to fade away, growing paler and thinner each day despite the best efforts of her devoted parents and the village doctor. More disturbing still were the reports that Evangeline had spent her final weeks engaged in lengthy conversations with her porcelain doll, speaking to the inanimate companion as if it were responding to her words with wisdom and comfort that no living person could provide. When Dr. Ashworth began her routine documentation and analysis of the photograph, she employed the standard digital enhancement techniques used by the museum to create detailed records of historical artifacts and to identify any damage or deterioration that might require conservation efforts. It was during this process that she made the discovery that would transform a simple Victorian portrait into evidence of practices that challenged everything historians thought they knew about childhood, religion, and folk magic in turn-of-the-century England. The initial enhancement revealed details that had been invisible to previous viewers, subtle elements that became apparent only when the image was subjected to high-resolution scanning and spectral analysis. Most significantly, Dr. Ashworth noticed that the doll's elaborate dress appeared to conceal a small irregularity in the porcelain torso, a barely perceptible line that suggested the presence of a hidden compartment or access panel that would not have been visible to casual observation. Working with Dr. James Morrison, a specialist in historical artifact analysis from Cambridge University, Dr. Ashworth applied increasingly sophisticated digital forensic techniques to examine every detail of the photograph. Using infrared spectroscopy and advanced image processing software originally developed for criminal investigations, they were able to penetrate the surface details of the image and reveal structural elements that had remained hidden for over a century. What they discovered defied rational explanation and opened a window into a world of Victorian supernatural practices that had been deliberately concealed from historical record. The doll's torso contained not one but 3 separate compartments, each carefully designed to be invisible to casual observation, but accessible to someone who knew the precise mechanism for opening them. More disturbing still, these compartments were not empty decorative features, but contained objects that spoke to practices far removed from innocent childhood play. The largest compartment, located behind the doll's intricately painted bodice, contained what appeared to be a small collection of human hair, carefully braided and bound with silk thread in the manner of Victorian mourning jewelry. The hair was dark brown, matching Evangeline's own coloring, but chemical analysis of the photographic image suggested that it had been cut from multiple sources, indicating that the child had been collecting hair samples from various individuals over an extended period. The second compartment, hidden within the doll's left arm, held what forensic analysis identified as human teeth, small molars that appeared to be milk teeth from multiple children. The teeth had been cleaned and polished with obsessive care, and they were arranged within the compartment, according to some system of organization that suggested ritualistic rather than merely collecting behavior. Most disturbing of all was the contents of the third compartment, concealed within the doll's elaborate coiffure beneath her mohair wig. This space contained what appeared to be small fragments of bone, pieces that had been carved with symbols and markings that bore resemblance to protective charms and ritualistic implements used in folk magic practices of the period. Dr. Morrison's analysis of these hidden contents led him to consult with Professor Helena Blackthorne, one of the world's leading experts on Victorian supernatural practices and folk magic traditions. Professor Blackthorne's research had focused on the persistence of pre-Christian beliefs and practices within ostensibly Christian communities, particularly the ways in which ancient magical traditions had been adapted and concealed within the framework of Victorian respectability. According to Professor Blackthorne's assessment, the objects concealed within Evangeline's doll represented a sophisticated form of sympathetic magic that had its roots in practices dating back to medieval and even pre-Roman British folk traditions. The collection of hair, teeth, and bone fragments suggested the creation of what folklorists term a life anchor, a magical construct designed to bind the life force of multiple individuals to a central object or location. What we're seeing in this photograph, Professor Blackthorne explained in her analysis, is evidence of a complex magical working that would have required extensive knowledge of traditional practices and access to materials that could only have been obtained through systematic collection over a considerable period of time. This is not the random accumulation of childhood treasures, but the deliberate construction of a supernatural artifact designed to serve a specific and very sophisticated purpose. The implications of this discovery led Dr. Ashworth to launch a comprehensive investigation into the history of the Blackwood family and the circumstances surrounding Evangeline's tragic death. What she uncovered painted a picture of a community where ancient superstitions and magical practices continued to flourish beneath the surface of Victorian respectability, hidden from the authorities and mainstream society, but very much alive among those who understood their power and significance. Evangeline Blackwood had been born into a family with deep roots in the Yorkshire countryside, descendants of a lineage that stretched back to the medieval period when the region had been known for its wise women and practitioners of traditional healing arts. Her grandmother, Constance Blackwood, had been locally famous as a herbalist and midwife, someone to whom the village women turned for remedies and advice that went far beyond conventional medicine. According to village records discovered in the local parish archives, Constance Blackwood had been investigated by church authorities on multiple occasions for practices that bordered on witchcraft, but her value to the community as a healer and her careful maintenance of at least superficial Christian observances had protected her from more serious persecution. She had passed down her knowledge to her daughter-in-law, Evangeline's mother, Rose, who had continued the family tradition of providing supernatural assistance to those in need while maintaining the appearance of conventional Victorian domesticity. The investigation revealed that Evangeline had been groomed from early childhood to inherit this family legacy, taught to recognize and collect the materials necessary for traditional magical workings while disguising these activities as innocent childhood play. The porcelain doll, which had been a gift from her grandmother on her 6th birthday, had been specially modified to serve as both a teaching tool and a repository for the magical materials that Evangeline was learning to identify and utilize. The hair collected in the doll's primary compartment had been gathered from specific individuals according to a complex system that took into account their health, social status, and spiritual condition. Each strand had been obtained through careful social interaction, often during village gatherings or church services, where Evangeline could approach other children and adults without arousing suspicion. The collection represented a cross-section of the village population, from the healthiest and most prosperous families to those suffering from illness or misfortune. The teeth stored in the doll's arm had been acquired through equally systematic means, collected from children throughout the region during the natural process of losing milk teeth. Evangeline had established herself as a kind of informal tooth fairy, offering small gifts or treats in exchange for teeth that would normally have been discarded or buried according to traditional customs. The villagers had seen this as harmless childhood eccentricity, unaware that they were contributing to a magical working of considerable complexity and power. The bone fragments hidden in the doll's hair were the most disturbing element of the collection, representing materials that could only have been obtained through grave robbing or other forms of illegal activity. Analysis of historical records revealed that several graves in the local churchyard had been disturbed during the period when Evangeline was actively collecting materials, with small amounts of bone and teeth reported missing from recently buried remains. The purpose of this elaborate collection became clearer when Dr. Ashworth discovered Constance Blackwood's personal grimoire, a handwritten book of magical instructions and spells that had been hidden within the walls of the family's cottage during renovations conducted in the 1970s. The grimoire contained detailed instructions for creating what it termed a soul anchor, a magical construct designed to bind the life force of an entire community to a central focus point that could be controlled by a skilled practitioner. According to the grimoire's instructions, the soul anchor was intended to serve as a form of supernatural insurance against disease, famine, and other disasters that regularly devastated rural communities during periods of economic and social upheaval. By collecting personal materials from every member of the community and binding them to a central focus through complex ritual workings, a skilled practitioner could theoretically redirect misfortune away from the village and toward external targets. The process required the participation of a child who had been specially prepared from birth to serve as the anchor's living component, someone whose innocence and natural psychic sensitivity would allow them to channel and control the collected life forces without being corrupted or destroyed by the process. Evangeline had been chosen for this role before her birth, selected through divination practices that had identified her as possessing the necessary spiritual qualities to survive the transformation. The doll had served as both a training device and a storage container for the materials Evangeline collected, but according to the grimoire, it was also intended to become a permanent repository for her own life force once the magical working was complete. The child would gradually transfer her consciousness and spiritual essence into the porcelain construct, allowing her to continue guiding and protecting the community even after her physical death. This process explained the mysterious circumstances surrounding Evangeline's final illness and death. According to the grimoire's instructions, the transfer of life force from human to artificial vessel was intended to be gradual and painless, with the child simply fading away over a period of weeks or months as her consciousness settled into its new home. The villagers would see only a natural death from illness, while those initiated into the family's magical traditions would understand that Evangeline had successfully completed her transformation and could now serve as their supernatural protector for generations to come. The investigation into Evangeline's fate led Dr. Ashworth to search for additional evidence of similar practices in other Yorkshire villages during the same period. What she discovered suggested that the Blackwood family's magical workings were part of a much larger network of traditional practitioners who had maintained ancient protective rituals despite the increasing modernization and Christian evangelization of rural England. Parish records from neighboring villages contained scattered references to children who had died under similar mysterious circumstances, always after periods of prolonged illness that defied medical explanation. In each case, the deceased child had been known for unusual behavior or interests that, when examined closely, suggested involvement in supernatural practices similar to those documented in the Blackwood Grimoire. More significantly, Dr. Ashworth discovered that many of these villages had experienced periods of unusual prosperity and protection from disasters during the years following the deaths of these specially prepared children. Communities that should have been devastated by crop failures, disease outbreaks, or economic downturns had somehow managed to avoid or minimize these disasters, often in ways that local authorities found difficult to explain through conventional means. The pattern suggested that the practice of creating soul anchors had been widespread throughout rural Yorkshire during the late Victorian period, representing a systematic effort by traditional magical practitioners to protect their communities against the uncertainties and dangers of modern life. The children who served as anchors were seen not as victims, but as heroes who had sacrificed their physical existence to ensure the survival and prosperity of their neighbours and families. Professor Blackthorne's research into similar practices in other parts of Britain revealed that the Yorkshire soul anchor tradition was part of a much older and more widespread system of protective magic that had its origins in pre-Christian Celtic and Anglo-Saxon religious practices. The use of specially prepared children as spiritual intermediaries could be traced back to Druidic traditions that had persisted in remote areas despite centuries of Christian missionary activity. The porcelain dolls used in these workings were not random choices, but represented a sophisticated understanding of sympathetic magic principles that recognized the power of human-like images to serve as vessels for transferred consciousness. The German doll makers who created these artifacts were often unaware of their supernatural applications, but their commitment to creating lifelike and emotionally compelling figures made their products ideal for magical purposes. The discovery of Evangeline's doll and its hidden contents raised disturbing questions about the fate of other children who had been prepared for similar roles throughout history. If the soul anchor tradition had been as widespread as the evidence suggested, there might be thousands of porcelain dolls, wooden figures, and other childhood toys scattered throughout antique collections and private homes, each containing the transferred consciousness of a child who had been sacrificed to protect their community. Dr. Ashworth's research team began examining other historical photographs and artifacts in the museum's collection, looking for signs of similar magical workings or evidence of children who had been prepared for supernatural roles. What they found suggested that the practice had continued well into the 20th century, adapting to changing social conditions and available materials while maintaining its essential structure and purpose. Modern forensic techniques applied to Victorian-era photographs revealed dozens of cases where children's toys and personal possessions contained hidden compartments, concealed materials, or other evidence of supernatural preparation. Teddy bears with secret pockets filled with hair and nail clippings, wooden toys carved with protective symbols, even simple rag dolls that had been stuffed with herbs and other magical materials according to traditional recipes. The implications of these discoveries forced historians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about Victorian childhood and the persistence of magical practices in supposedly rational and Christian communities. The evidence suggested that a significant portion of rural British society had maintained active connections to pre-Christian spiritual traditions, using children as intermediaries to negotiate with supernatural forces and protect their communities from the uncertainties of modern life. The photograph of Evangeline Blackwood and her doll became the centerpiece of a new understanding of Victorian supernatural practices, revealing the sophisticated magical workings that had operated beneath the surface of respectable society. The image captured not just a moment of childhood innocence, but the final stages of a complex spiritual transformation that had been planned and executed over the course of years. The doll itself, with its hidden compartments and carefully collected materials, represented centuries of accumulated magical knowledge and the desperate efforts of rural communities to maintain some measure of control over their fate in an increasingly uncertain world. Evangeline's transformation from living child to spiritual anchor had been the culmination of traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of human settlement in the Yorkshire countryside. Modern analysis of the photograph continued to reveal new details about the magical working that had been captured in that summer afternoon in 1900. Enhanced imaging techniques showed that the doll's glass eyes had been specially treated with substances that would have made them more receptive to spiritual energies, and the careful arrangement of Evangeline's hands suggested that she was in the process of performing a ritual gesture at the moment the photograph was taken. The discovery that the image had been taken during the actual performance of a magical ritual, rather than simply as a family portrait, added another layer of significance to the photograph. The photographer, Marcus Whitman, had unknowingly documented one of the most complex supernatural workings ever captured on film, preserving for posterity the exact moment when a child's consciousness began its transfer into an artificial vessel. The fate of the actual doll remained a mystery until 2021, when renovation work at a cottage in Thornfield uncovered a sealed room that had been hidden behind false walls for over a century. The room contained the preserved remains of what appeared to be a magical workshop, complete with shelves of herbs, bottles of various liquids, and ceremonial implements that matched descriptions in the Blackwood Grimoire. At the center of this hidden chamber, seated in a small chair and surrounded by protective circles drawn in salt and other materials, was Evangeline's porcelain doll. The artifact had been preserved in perfect condition, its clothing and features as pristine as they had been in the 1900 photograph. More significantly, the doll had been positioned as if it were actively observing the room, its glass eyes focused on the doorway with an intensity that suggested continued awareness and purpose. When experts examined the preserved doll, they discovered that the hidden compartments identified in the photograph were indeed present and still contained their original contents. The hair, teeth, and bone fragments had been perfectly preserved by the same conditions that had protected the rest of the magical workshop, creating a time capsule that provided unprecedented insight into Victorian supernatural practices. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the doll appeared to have been regularly maintained and cared for throughout the century since Evangeline's death. The clothing had been periodically cleaned and repaired, fresh flowers had been placed around the chair, and new materials had been added to the hidden compartments, suggesting that someone had continued to honor and serve the spiritual entity that resided within the porcelain form. Investigation into the cottage's ownership revealed that it had remained in the Blackwood family through 5 generations, passed down through a secretive lineage of women who had maintained the magical traditions established by Constance Blackwood. Each generation had produced at least one daughter who was initiated into the family's supernatural practices and charged with caring for Evangeline's transformed consciousness. The current caretaker, identified as Mary Thornfield, was the great-great-granddaughter of Evangeline's cousin and had spent her entire life maintaining the hidden chamber and performing the rituals necessary to sustain the soul anchor's protective influence over the village. According to Mary's testimony, Evangeline's spirit had continued to guide and protect the community throughout the 20th century, helping residents avoid disasters and providing supernatural assistance during times of crisis. The revelation that the soul anchor tradition had continued into the modern era raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the persistence of magical practices, and the ways in which ancient supernatural traditions had adapted to survive in an increasingly rational and scientific world. The photograph of Evangeline and her doll served as evidence that the boundaries between life and death, physical and spiritual, innocent childhood play, and sophisticated magical working were far more permeable than modern society was prepared to acknowledge. The true nature of what was captured in that innocent-seeming Victorian portrait continues to challenge our understanding of history, consciousness, and the hidden forces that shape human experience. In the serious expression of an 8-year-old girl and the carefully crafted features of her porcelain companion, we see evidence of magical traditions that have persisted for centuries, adapting and evolving while maintaining their essential purpose of protecting human communities against the uncertainties and dangers of existence. The mystery of Evangeline Blackwood and her remarkable doll reminds us that the past holds secrets that continue to influence the present in ways we are only beginning to understand. Behind the facade of Victorian respectability and childhood innocence lay a world of supernatural knowledge and practice that challenges everything we think we know about the nature of reality and the power of human consciousness to transcend the limitations of physical existence. The true story behind this seemingly innocent photograph remains as mysterious today as it was in 1900, but we want to know your thoughts. Use the comment section below and tell us what you believe about the persistence of magical practices in modern society, and whether you think consciousness can truly be transferred from human to artificial vessels. If you're fascinated by unraveling the secrets behind history's darkest mysteries, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because there are many more enigmas waiting to be uncovered, hidden in the shadows of the past, waiting for someone brave enough to bring them into the light.